Welcome to the mysterious case book. In the quiet pews of St. Mary Mead, a whispered promise turns deadly. A Sunday of hymns ends in suspicion and sin. Are you listening under a lamplight or in the hush before dawn? Now pour your tea, still your breath, and let the mystery begin. The church bells of St. Mary Mead rang out with their habitual serenity, silver and orderly against a morning sky of palest blue. The village gathered in slow, familiar procession, the vicar's wife in dove-grey silk, Mr. Badger, the organist, wiping his spectacles with undue care, and Miss Marple herself, seated modestly beneath the north window, her gloved hands folded over a hymn book she knew almost by heart. It was the sort of Sunday that seemed incapable of producing anything but peace. Yet even as the organ murmured its prelude, something faintly awry hovered in the air like the hesitation of a clock between ticks. The pews creaked with restless motion. A whisper moved along the aisle where Mrs. Price Ridley bent toward Mrs. Clements, the latter's veil trembling with what might have been suppressed laughter or anxiety. Miss Marple did not look up. She rarely did when something unusual occurred. It was far more revealing to listen. Her hearing, sharpened by years of testable confidences and the rustle of parish gossip, caught the sentence like a thread snagging on lace. Said he'd see her dead before noon. The phrase slipped back into the stillness, half lost beneath the first bars of All Things Bright and Beautiful. Miss Marple's pale eyes rested on the vicar's back as he ascended the pulpit. She made no outward sign, yet her mind turned gently, like a flower orienting toward an unexpected draught of wind. The service proceeded with dutiful reverence. The congregation sang, some earnestly, others distractedly. The children fidgeted, the collection plate gleamed, and sunlight dappled the brass lectern. Only Miss Marple seemed aware that harmony was no longer true harmony, but the fragile imitation of it. During the sermon, a meditation on forgiveness, the air grew close. Miss Hartnell's lace collar wilted perceptibly, and Colonel Melchett yawned behind his hymn book. But when the vicar paused for effect, a curious sound broke the rhythm, the scrape of a pew, abrupt and discordant, as Mrs. Julian rose unsteadily to her feet. Her face, usually neat and composed, was white as parchment. "Two must go," she murmured, though to whom she spoke was uncertain. She slipped toward the aisle, the faint scent of lavender following her. Her departure drew every eye except one pair, the calm grey ones of Miss Marple, who merely adjusted the small posy pinned to her hat, as though marking the movement in her own quiet ledger. Outside, the churchyard basked in honest sunlight. Bees traced lazy spirals over the graves, yet a faint unease lingered, as if something had been promised, something unpleasant, and the morning itself were waiting to see whether the promise would be kept. After the final hymn, the villagers spilled out into the lane with the relief of school children dismissed. Mrs. Price Ridley gathered her skirts and began at once, sotto voce. It was quite indecent, leaving in the middle. Poor Mrs. Julian, though of course one never knows what goes on behind closed curtains. Mr. Badger, who prided himself on discretion, ventured a half-humorous remark about fainting spells, which no one found particularly funny. The talk shifted, but the tremor it caused remained. In a community where routine was as sacred as a doctrine, even a small breach in decorum could become the nucleus of a storm. Miss Marple lingered by the lich gate, nodding to acquaintances, her mind already cataloguing details, the whisper about a threat, the curious pallor of Mrs. Julian, the peculiar tension that had gripped the congregation just before the hymn. Patterns of human behavior, she had long observed, tended to repeat themselves, however varied the wallpaper of circumstance. "Lovely morning, Miss Marple," called Mr. Hawes, the curate too hearty by half. "Indeed, Mr. Hawes," she replied mildly, "though sometimes one feels the day is lovelier than it ought to be." He looked puzzled, smiled uncertainly, and hurried off to secure the offertory bag. At the vicarage gate, Mrs. Clements and Mrs. Price Ridley stood locked in that delicate duel of moral superiority that served the village's entertainment. "She's not been herself since the garden fete," said Mrs. Clements with a meaningful sigh. "Quiet. And did you notice the color of her gloves? Mourning, I shouldn't wonder." Miss Marple passed them with an apologetic smile. Gossip, she reflected, was not unlike the pollen carried by those same bees-light, pervasive, capable of settling where one least expected it. And sometimes, within that dust, lay the seed of something deadly. By the time she reached her cottage, the church bells had ceased, leaving the air curiously hollow. She placed her hat upon its peg, set the kettle upon the hob, and allowed herself one quiet thought the phrase whispered in church had not been spoken idly. People said such things with purpose or with fear, and whichever it was, she would soon enough find out. Outside, a single cloud drifted across the sun, dimming the room. The clock on her mantelpiece paused just a fraction, a hesitation between ticks before it continued, steady and inexorable. The faint pause in Miss Marple's mantel clock lingered in her thoughts long after she had poured her tea. Outside, St. Mary Mead resumed its gentle rhythm, but it was not quite the same rhythm as before. Like a pianola slightly out of tune, the day had a tremor running beneath it. People walked faster, voices carried further, and every glance seemed to carry the unspoken question that had begun to stir since Mrs. Julian's hasty exit from morning service. By 2:30, gossip had ripened into full bloom. It began, as most things did, at the post office, where Mrs. Price Ridley and Mrs. Clements met under the pretext of buying stamps. "I was saying to Colonel Melchett only this morning," Mrs. Price Ridley began, though in fact she hadn't, that it was quite unnatural behavior, leaving like that. "You don't simply walk out of church without reason." "Unless," said Mrs. Clements with relish, "you've something on your conscience." Miss Hartnell, entering at that moment to post a letter, caught the phrase and carried it away like a bee leaving with pollen. Within the hour, it had reached Mrs. Haydock at the hairdresser's and the maid at the vicarage. By tea-time, half the village could have drawn a map of Mrs. Julian's supposed secrets, though no two would have agreed on the details. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat knitting by her parlour window, her mind weaving subtler patterns than her needles. Gossip, she knew, was often less about its subject than its tellers. One learned as much from who repeated a rumour as from what it contained. When she heard the latch of her garden gate, she looked up to see a familiar figure, Inspector Cray, the village constable, looking awkwardly apologetic. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said. "Hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, Mr. Cray. I was just considering how quickly news travels when one doesn't want it to. Do come in, the kettle's still warm." He removed his cap and followed her inside, blinking at the cozy domesticity that always seemed to soften his authority. "It's only when the vicar asked me to make a few inquiries," he began. "About Mrs. Julian. Seems she never reached home after she left the church." Miss Marple's hands paused, the needles suspended mid-air like twin silver question marks. "How strange," she murmured. "Her cottage is scarcely half a mile from St. Mary Mead, and she's not a woman given to wandering." "That's just it, ma'am. Her maid says she hasn't been seen since. No note, no luggage, nothing missing but her handbag." Miss Marple poured the tea with unhurried grace. "Did she perhaps call on anyone? Mrs. Price Ridley, perhaps?" Cray gave a faint smile. "If she had, we'd all know it by now. The vicar's wife says she looked troubled during the sermon, though that could mean anything." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, trouble can mean a dozen things, depending on who says it. In Mrs. Clement's mouth, it often means guilty." Cray hesitated, his hat twisting between his hands. "Would you happen to know, Miss Marple, if there was any, unpleasantness between Mrs. Julian and anyone else in the parish?" "Unpleasantness," Miss Marple repeated softly, as if testing the flavor of the word. "That's a rather large net to cast, Mr. Cray, but let me think about the matter of the charity bazaar last spring, when Mrs. Julian accused Mr. Badger of short-changing the flower fund. Quite publicly, too. And I believe Mrs. Price Ridley has never forgiven her for winning the rose competition twice in a row." Cray's pencil hovered uncertainly. "That's helpful, I suppose. Only if you know how to read people," Miss Marple said gently. "It's seldom the grand quarrels that lead to tragedy. It's the small slights that polite people never quite forgive." After Cray left, Miss Marple sat for some time gazing into the fading light. The pattern of her knitting had gone slightly awry. She corrected it absent-mindedly, her mind replaying the morning service. The whisper she'd overheard he'd see her dead before noon had not been followed by alarm or outcry. Whoever spoke those words had not meant to be overheard, and yet, at that moment, the church had been full of listeners. Outside, the evening drew its long shadows over the village. The vicarage curtains glowed with lamplight, and the faint strains of the organ drifted through an open window. Mr. Badger, practicing alone, each note too precise to be comforting. Miss Marple rose and crossed to her writing desk. From a small drawer, she drew out an old notebook, its pages filled with neat, looping handwriting. At the top of a fresh page she wrote, "Sunday Mrs. Julian vanished after morning service." Below that is the phrase, "See her dead before noon." Voice male, middle-aged, controlled. She paused, tapping her pen lightly. Then another entry. Mrs. Julian known for lavender scent, composure, mild temper. Departed suddenly fear or guilt. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. The housekeeper from next door, young Amy Hargreaves, stood at the door, pale and uncertain. "Beg pardon, Miss Marple," she said. "I thought you should know they've found something in the vicarage garden." The constable said not to tell, but Miss Marple's expression did not change, though her eyes sharpened. "What sort of something, Amy?" Amy swallowed. "Her handbag, ma'am." Mrs. Julian's handbag. It was under the rose bushes, near the path to the vestry door. Miss Marple closed her notebook softly. "Thank you, my dear. That was very right of you to come." Amy nodded, clearly relieved to have shared the burden, and hurried off into the gathering dusk. Miss Marple stood a moment longer by the open door, listening to the hush settling over the lane. Somewhere in the distance, the church clock began to strike 6. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet air, each chime falling like a measured heartbeat. She thought again of that phrase. A promise, spoken in anger, perhaps, or cold resolve he'd see her dead before noon. And now the day was ending, and Mrs. Julian had not been seen alive since. Miss Marple turned back into the room where the last light of the sun caught the edge of her teacup and made it glimmer faintly, like something precious and fragile. "Before noon," she murmured, half to herself. "And yet here we are, almost evening." Her gaze rested on the mantel clock once more. It ticked now with perfect regularity, as though nothing in the world had ever been out of order. The following morning arrived washed in pale gold, the kind of deceptive sunlight that makes everything appear more innocent than it is. From her window, Miss Marple could see the small procession forming once again outside St. Mary Mead's post office, women with baskets, men pretending to mind their own business, and an invisible current of speculation flowing briskly among them. Something had happened overnight, though no one yet knew the particulars. They only knew, as villagers do, that there was news worth knowing. At 9:30, a police motor car from Much Benham rolled into the lane, setting curtains fluttering like startled birds. Inspector Hargrave himself emerged a solid man of middle age, with the kind of face that believed in facts more than intuition. He conferred briefly with Constable Cray before striding toward the vicarage, his gait brisk but his expression troubled. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had finished her toast and was washing her teacup with habitual care. She had long ago learned that certain truths come best to those who appear least eager to find them. When the knock came at her door, 3 firm taps, she was almost expecting it. "Inspector Hargrave," she said with gentle surprise. "Do come in. I imagine this isn't merely a social call." He managed a polite nod. "Good morning, Miss Marple. I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. I'm making preliminary inquiries about Mrs. Julian." "She hasn't been found, then?" Miss Marple said quietly. Hargrave's mouth tightened. "I'm afraid she has. Early this morning near the vestry well. It appears she fell, though the matter isn't as simple as that." Miss Marple inclined her head, her face calm. "Ah, so the promise was kept?" The inspector frowned. "I beg your pardon?" "Nothing of importance," she said quickly. "Do go on." He glanced down at his notebook. No signs of robbery. Her handbag was empty but intact. The cause of death was a blow to the head, likely from striking the stonework. There's something else. Her gloves were missing, but we found one near the hedge bordering Mr. Badger's cottage. "The organist's?" "Yes. He says he was practicing most of yesterday afternoon, but several people claim they heard the organ only intermittently." Hargrave paused. "You've known Mr. Badger for some time, I believe?" "Indeed. He arrived to replace poor Mr. Finch in '47. A capable musician, though somewhat proud of his position. He takes moral disapproval very seriously, which is dangerous in a man with few outlets for emotion." Hargrave's pencil paused mid-scribble. "You think he could?" "I think," said Miss Marple mildly, "that jealousy comes in many forms. Sometimes it isn't romantic at all." He closed his notebook with a sigh. "Well, the coroner will have the final say, but if you'll permit me, I may call again. The villagers seem to confide in you." "They do, rather," Miss Marple agreed. "People like to feel their stories are being safely kept. Unfortunately, they often forget stories can be evidence." After he left, Miss Marple walked into her garden, the air fragrant with early roses. From the lane came the sound of hurried footsteps. Mrs. Price Ridley again, her expression avid with news. "My dear Miss Marple," she began breathlessly, "have you heard? Mrs. Julian dead, poor creature, found by the vestry wall. Such a dreadful business, and they say it was Mr. Badger who discovered her. He's been taken to the police station for questioning." "How very trying for him," Miss Marple murmured. "Oh, I shouldn't wonder if it wasn't entirely undeserved," said Mrs. Price Ridley, lowering her voice. "After all, he and Mrs. Julian were seen together rather too often in recent months, discussing hymn selections, I dare say." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Hymns can be quite dangerous things, in the wrong hands." Mrs. Price Ridley blinked, uncertain whether she'd been agreed with or contradicted, and swept off to share her revelation elsewhere. Left alone, Miss Marple wandered to her gate and stood watching the vicarage garden across the lane. Constable Cray was kneeling near the roses, marking a patch of disturbed soil. Beyond him, the vestry door stood ajar, the shadow within too dark for daylight. She had an impulse to go nearer, not from morbid curiosity, but because she could not shake the feeling that something about the scene was inconsistent. She took her umbrella and set out, walking slowly. The constable straightened as she approached. "Best not come too close, ma'am," he said respectfully. "I won't interfere, Mr. Cray. I only wondered whether Mrs. Julian's body was facing toward the church or away from it." He blinked. "Away, ma'am, toward the hedge." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly. "How very odd." She thanked him and turned back, mind humming. People rarely turned their backs on the church unless they were walking away from something or someone who frightened them. Later that day, she took tea with Mrs. Haydock, who had been at the hairdresser's when the first whispers spread. The conversation was all sympathy and scandal, but Miss Marple listened for undercurrents. "It's a pity," Mrs. Haydock sighed. "Such a quiet woman, Mrs. Julian, never the sort to make enemies. Sometimes quiet people make the most dangerous enemies, Miss Marple observed. One forgets they exist until they act. By evening, the news had settled into the village like smoke. The church bell tolled once for the dead, and a drizzle began, blurring the edges of the cottages. Inside her parlour, Miss Marple set aside her knitting and looked again at her notebook. She wrote, "Body found near vestry wall, facing away from church. One glove near the organist's hedge." Then, after a pause, "If he discovered her, who called the constable?" It was a small question, almost invisible amid the larger ones, but Miss Marple had learned that such questions were often the hinge on which truth turned. When she closed the book, the rain had deepened into a steady rhythm against the panes. The village, that delicate organism of propriety and gossip, was closing its shutters against the night. Yet behind every shutter, someone was thinking not of sorrow, but of fear. And Miss Marple, in her quiet room, was thinking of promises made at morning service, promises spoken softly enough to seem prayerful, and yet meant for destruction. The rain had scarcely ceased by morning, leaving the churchyard glistening and the air thick with that curious stillness that follows scandal. The villagers moved softly, as though fearful of disturbing the echo of what had happened. Inside St. Mary Mead's church, the vicar stood by the pulpit with a face that belonged to both prayer and despair. Miss Marple, arriving with her umbrella closed and neatly furled, greeted him with a small nod, neither sympathetic nor inquisitive, merely human. "It's dreadful, Miss Marple," said Reverend Leonard. "Truly dreadful. She was one of our kindest parishioners, and to think she died upon consecrated ground." Miss Marple's eyes wandered to the polished wood of the pews, the faint smudge of mud near the vestry door, and the pattern of footprints still faintly visible on the flagstones. "Consecrated ground has seen all manner of things, Reverend," she said gently. "It doesn't make them less human, only more visible." He sighed, mistaking her observation for comfort. "They say it was poor Mr. Badger. The police found his gloves stained and his organ keys, well, they said there was a mark, though perhaps from nothing more sinister than dust." "Dust is a great accomplice in misunderstanding," Miss Marple murmured. "It settles where no one expects it." As the vicar moved away to confer with Inspector Hargrave, Miss Marple bent slightly to examine the stone near the vestry step. It bore a faint green smear, moss displaced perhaps, or fabric dye rubbed in haste. She didn't touch it. Some clues were best left for the moment when they could speak most clearly. A voice startled her. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" She turned to find Mrs. Julian's niece, Miss Clara Denning, standing in the aisle. The young woman had arrived the night before, pale from travel and sleeplessness. Her grief was quiet but composed, like someone holding back a tide through sheer determination. "Yes, my dear," said Miss Marple softly. "I knew your aunt well enough to know she was not one for drama. I'm sorry you must return under such unhappy circumstances." Clara's lips tightened. Aunt Eleanor was careful. Too careful, sometimes. She wouldn't have argued with anyone. "People often say that after a tragedy," Miss Marple said. "But I've found that the quietest souls keep the deepest silences. They hold on to things the rest of us are too noisy to remember." Clara hesitated. "Do you think they'll charge him? The organist?" Miss Marple regarded her thoughtfully. "The police believe in evidence. I believe in character. They sometimes meet halfway." A flutter of voices by the door interrupted Mrs. Price Ridley again, whispering animatedly to Mrs. Clements. He was always hanging about the vestry, and those late-night rehearsals. "Not to mention," said Mrs. Clements, "that he wrote her letters. I've seen his handwriting on envelopes." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but inwardly she registered the escalation. Gossip was no longer a pastime, it was now self-protection. In a village, when one person is accused, everyone else becomes desperate to seem innocent. Outside, the clouds were breaking apart, and the sun struck the church tower with startling brightness. It gleamed like an accusation. Miss Marple paused on the path, noticing how quickly beauty returned to scenes of unpleasantness, as though the world itself were eager to look respectable again. Mr. Badger's cottage lay just beyond the churchyard, its curtains drawn tight. She hesitated only a moment before tapping lightly on the door. The man who opened it looked older than he had a day ago. His eyes were rimmed red, his hands still stained faintly with ink and something darker. "I suppose you've come to judge me as well," he said bitterly. "My dear Mr. Badger," said Miss Marple, stepping inside, "I never judge before tea." He gave a broken laugh and gestured for her to sit. The room smelled of polish and old paper, the kind of scent that clings to solitary men. I told them I didn't touch her. She came to the church that morning before service to speak with me about a matter of music. She said the hymn she'd chosen for next week had meaning, too much meaning. Then she left. I never saw her alive again. Miss Marple's knitting bag rested quietly in her lap. A hymn with too much meaning. "That's rather poetic, Mr. Badger. Do you recall which one?" He stared into his cold teacup. "Lead Kindly Light." She said it wasn't suitable for the harvest service and that it felt like a farewell. Miss Marple's needles were motionless. A farewell. And did she say to whom? He looked up sharply. No, but she seemed frightened, as though someone had reminded her of something she wanted to forget. When she left, Miss Marple lingered by the gate, her thoughts turning like the weather, momentarily bright, then shadowed again. Appearances, she reflected, could be as misleading as hymns. Both could sound innocent until one heard the note out of tune. From the direction of the vicarage came a cry of someone calling the inspector in haste. Miss Marple turned, eyes narrowing. Whatever had just been found, it would either cloud the truth further or bring it to the edge of light. She could not yet tell which. The cry from the vicarage drew several figures toward the gate at once, Inspector Hargrave striding from the church path, Constable Cray hurrying behind him, and Miss Marple, her umbrella clicking softly upon the gravel. The source of the commotion was Mrs. Clements, pale and trembling, pointing toward the vicarage well. A small cluster of villagers had already gathered, their faces alight with the mingled excitement and dread that death always stirs in a small community. "It's the other glove," Mrs. Clements gasped. "The second one they've just pulled out from the well bucket." Inspector Hargrave signaled for the crowd to step back, but the damage was done and rumor would travel faster than any constable. Miss Marple, pausing at the garden edge, noted how sunlight glanced off the wet glove where it lay draped across a stone. Its leather was faintly warped, as though scorched. A curious thing, she thought, for something submerged in water. Hargrave turned sharply to Cray. "Send it for examination, and no more spectators for heaven's sake." The villagers dispersed in reluctant murmurs. Miss Marple remained where she was, her gaze shifting from the well to the vicarage kitchen window. Behind the lace curtains, she could just make out the silhouette of the vicar's wife, still and watchful. "An unfortunate business," Miss Marple said softly. Hargrave grunted. "If this glove belongs to the organist, it strengthens the case." His first glove was near the hedge, this one practically in his own backyard. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "though I've known many men guilty of pride, but few guilty of leaving their gloves about." He regarded her with mild impatience. "You have a theory, no doubt." "Only a habit of noticing how often facts prefer to dress themselves up," she replied, and turned toward the churchyard, her umbrella tip pressing small dark circles into the damp earth. As she passed the vestry wall, something pale caught her eye. Bending slightly, she saw a scrap of paper pressed into a crevice between two stones softened by rain but still legible. She drew it out delicately. It was part of a hymn leaflet, torn from the Sunday bulletin. The printed title read, "Lead Kindly Light," and in the margin, faint pencil marks traced a line beneath the words, One step enough for me. A tremor of thought passed through her mind. That phrase had been the one Mrs. Julian and Mr. Badger discussed. Coincidence, perhaps, but Miss Marple seldom believed in such things. At the sound of footsteps behind her, she slipped the fragment into her glove. It was only Clara Denning, her eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. "They won't let me see her," the girl said in a low voice. "I suppose that's sensible. But I can't help thinking she didn't fall, did she? They say accident, yet everyone whispers otherwise." "Whispers," said Miss Marple gently, "are like smoke from a candle. They drift toward whatever draught one leaves open. Tell me, my dear, did your aunt ever mention any difficulty of a personal kind? Money, perhaps, or someone from her past?" Clara hesitated. She was anxious lately. I thought it was only nerves. Letters came from London, and she hid them away quickly. And there was a man once, long before she came here. I only overheard the name once, Mr. Denholm, I think. But Aunt never spoke of him again. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Denholm. Curious. A name with a sound of confidence and concealment. Clara gave a faint, bewildered smile. "You make everything sound like poetry, Miss Marple." "Ah, but poetry and crime have something in common," she said. "Each depends upon choosing the right words or leaving them out." As they walked together toward the lane, Miss Marple's thoughts aligned quietly. If Mrs. Julian had received letters, someone must have seen the postmark. The village postmistress was a woman of impeccable discretion, which, Miss Marple knew, meant she shared her secrets selectively. She left Clara at the vicarage gate and crossed to the post office. Inside, the air was scented with paper and peppermint. Mrs. Weatherby looked up from her ledger. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. Terrible goings-on, I must say. I hope you're keeping well." "As well as one can when mysteries are thrust upon one, my dear," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "I was only wondering, did Mrs. Julian happen to receive any post this past week from London?" Mrs. Weatherby's brow puckered. As a matter of fact, yes. Thick envelope it was. Hand delivered on Friday by the early train. I noticed the sender's name. Solicitor's Stationery, I think. Denholm and Pike, Chancery Lane. "Thank you," said Miss Marple softly. "That clears a fog or two." Back in her sitting room, she unfolded the hymn fragment once more and studied the penciled line. "One step is enough for me." Perhaps it had been meant as comfort, or perhaps as warning. Either way, it was written by a hand that feared going further. A knock at her door broke the reverie. It was Inspector Hargrave, his manner brisk. "Miss Marple, I thought you'd wish to know we found ashes in the church stove. Bits of paper and what looks like sealing wax. The vicar says no one lit a fire yesterday." Miss Marple met his gaze calmly. "Ashes," she said, folding the hymn leaflet between her fingers. "Yes, Inspector. It seems even here, the truth insists on being burned before it can be read." Inspector Hargrave's words lingered in the air like faint smoke, curling into Miss Marple's thoughts long after he had gone. She stood before her small hearth, watching the low fire's glow tremble against the teapot's polished surface. Ashes in the church stove are a curious thing indeed. In St. Mary Mead, fires were usually kept for comfort, not concealment. She slipped on her cardigan and set out once more toward the church. The evening was damp, the path slick with drizzle, and lamplight pooled in the puddles like fragments of stained glass. The nave lay in half shadow when she entered, the smell of wax and cold stone mingling in the air. Near the vestry, Hargrave and Constable Cray were conferring quietly beside the small iron stove. Miss Marple's approach went unnoticed until the faint tap of her umbrella on the floor drew their attention. "I thought you might permit an old woman's curiosity," she said mildly. "Ashes are rather revealing when one knows what to look for." Hargrave gave a short, resigned nod. "You might as well have a glance." We've found only fragments of burnt paper, traces of wax, and something metallic fused to the grate. She peered in, her eyes narrowing. Among the charred scraps was a half-melted object that caught the faint light, the clasp of a small envelope, or perhaps the corner of a metal seal. She noticed, too, a delicate curve of handwriting on one surviving shred, the tail of a letter that might have been a D. Denholm. She murmured, almost inaudibly. Hargrave's brow furrowed. "You've thought of something." "Oh, merely a small recollection," she said, straightening. "Sometimes what burns away tells us as much as what remains." He looked as though he wanted to ask more, but Miss Marple's tone had the gentle finality of a door closing. Instead, he busied himself with the evidence bag, while Cray fetched a lantern. From the porch, they were joined unexpectedly by Clara Denning. She looked pale but determined, her coat thrown hastily over a dark dress. "Inspector, I was told you'd found something new," she said. "Please, if it concerns my aunt's letters." Hargrave hesitated. "We've recovered partial remains of correspondence." "Nothing conclusive yet." The girl's eyes flashed. "Then it's true. Someone destroyed them. Aunt Eleanor said once that truth never burns completely. I didn't understand her then." Miss Marple watched her closely. The remark had the sound of something remembered too precisely, as though rehearsed. "Your aunt was a woman who chose her words with care," she said gently. "Did she ever confide why those letters troubled her?" Clara's gaze faltered, only that they concerned an old promise, one she wished she'd never made. The vicar appeared at that moment, his face grave. "If I may, Inspector, I believe the stove was last used Saturday evening after choir practice." Mr. Badger asked leave to warm his hands before locking up. Hargrave turned sharply. So he had access to it. "Yes," said the vicar slowly. But he wasn't alone. Mrs. Julian came back to the vestry briefly. I saw her entering as I left. That single admission hung like incense smoke, faint, pervasive, and impossible to ignore. Hargrave's expression hardened. "You failed to mention this before, Reverend." "I thought it irrelevant," the vicar stammered. "She was alive then, and well, one hesitates to involve the church in unpleasantness." Miss Marple's eyes, mild and blue, rested on him a moment longer than comfort allowed. "Respectability, Reverend, is often a far riskier idol than sin itself. It blinds even the righteous." A silence followed, broken only by the drip of rain through the guttering. Clara's hands trembled slightly on the back of a pew. "If the letters were burnt," she whispered, "then someone knew they were dangerous." "Or personal," Miss Marple said softly. "Not every secret threatens life. Some merely threaten reputation." Hargrave sighed. "I'll have Mr. Badger brought in again. There's too much smoke about him, literal and otherwise." When they left, Miss Marple lingered in the nave, her gaze sweeping over the orderly pews and the gilt lettering of the hymn boards. There was something almost cruel about the tidiness of it all. Human life, she reflected, was never so neatly arranged. It had corners, hidden drawers, forgotten dust. As she turned to go, her eye caught the brass offering plate left upon the side table. A single coin lay upon it, not silver, but dull and unevenly blackened, as though it too had been near fire. She lifted it lightly, examining the edges. Fused wax clung to its rim. Perhaps nothing, perhaps everything. Outside, she paused beneath the churchyard yew. Mist was rising again, softening the gravestones into pale silhouettes. The world looked cleansed, almost tranquil. Yet beneath that calm surface, she could sense the same current that had begun in morning service, something promised, something fulfilled. In the distance, a shutter banged in the wind, and the echo mingled with a faint, rhythmic sound, the far-off tolling of the church clock marking the hour. To anyone else it was ordinary, but to Miss Marple's ear, it beat like a heart under strain. The last toll of the church clock seemed to fold itself into the mist, leaving St. Mary Mead suspended in that peculiar stillness before the world decides what it will do next. Miss Marple, standing by the gate, heard the faint crunch of hurried footsteps on gravel. A moment later, Constable Cray appeared, breathless and pale beneath his cap. "Miss Marple, thank heavens. Inspector sent me. There's been another discovery." Her hand tightened slightly on her umbrella handle. "Another?" "In the organ loft," he said, his voice low. "Something left there during the night or so, it seems. The vicar found it just now." Without further word, Miss Marple followed him through the side door. The air inside was cool and damp, steeped in the faint scent of polish and candle smoke. They climbed the narrow stair to the loft, where the great wooden pipes loomed like sentinels. On the organ bench lay a folded piece of paper weighted by a hymn book. The inspector stood nearby, his expression grim. "We found this at dawn," he said quietly. "No footprints in the nave, no forced entry. The note's unsigned." He handed it to her. The handwriting was sharp, angular, and unmistakably deliberate. It read, "She was not the first to break faith, nor the last to be forgiven." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. "Not the first, not the last. That sounds more like a sermon than a confession." "Or a threat," Hargrave muttered. "If someone can slip into the church undetected, they can do worse." Badger swears he didn't write it, of course. Says he spent the night with his sister in much Benham. Does she confirm that? She does. Regrettably? Miss Marple placed the paper down carefully. The tone was not panicked, not guilty, more reflective. A person who wished to justify rather than deny. She stepped closer to the pipes, her gloved hand brushing faint dust from one of the lower boards. A few particles clung to the leather of her glove, blackened soot and something finer, like ash. "The same residue from the vestry stove," she murmured. "Yet there's no reason for it here, unless someone carries it." Hargrave gave a humorless laugh. "You can smell conspiracy in a hymn book, Miss Marple." "Not in the hymn book, Inspector, between its pages." She turned to Cray. "Might I borrow your lantern, dear?" Under the flicker of light, she lifted the book that had pinned the note. Its edges were singed ever so slightly invisible unless one looked closely. She opened it, revealing the title page, "Songs of Faith and Farewell." A mark in pencil under one hymn drew her attention. "Let the fiery trial prove thee true." "Curious," she said softly. "How many of our melodies concern purification?" Hargrave looked weary. "You think the murderer's a moralist now?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that guilt often masquerades as virtue when it fears discovery." They descended the steps together, and as they reached the nave, the door creaked open to admit Clara Denning. She was still dressed in mourning black, her gloved hands gripping the pew edge as though for balance. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I've just had a telephone call from London. From Mr. Pike, he's my aunt's solicitor. He said her letter of instructions reached him this morning." "What sort of instructions?" Her voice trembled. "A change to her will. She made it last week. She left nearly everything in the cottage, her savings to the parish, to the church." Hargrave's eyes narrowed. "And who witnessed it?" "Mr. Badger," she admitted reluctantly. "And the vicar." That small disclosure shifted the air around them like a subtle draught. Miss Marple could feel the tremor it caused. Hargrave muttered. So both men stood to gain respect and suspicion. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Clara's face. "Forgive me, my dear, but was your aunt's decision a surprise to you?" "I can't pretend otherwise. She'd always said the house would come to me one day." Clara's voice hardened. "Perhaps she changed her mind under influence. Perhaps," Miss Marple said gently, "or perhaps she foresaw what influence would do after her death." The inspector looked from one woman to the other. "We'll need that solicitor's statement." If the will benefits the church, motive isn't short supply. As he spoke, a shaft of light broke through the clouded windows, glancing off the lectern's brass eagle and striking the pulpit. The sudden brightness was startling, a too perfect symbol of revelation, as though the building itself wished to accuse. Miss Marple watched the light fade again, and thought how truth behaved much the same way, appearing too soon, blinding those who looked at it directly. Outside, the sound of running feet shattered the stillness once more. Constable Cray rushed back through the door, his voice tight with urgency. "Inspector, they've found the vicar's wife." Hargrave's head jerked up. "Found her? What is heaven's name?" Cray swallowed. "In the rectory garden. Unconscious. Looks like she's been poisoned." The echo of his words lingered, carrying the faint chill of inevitability. Miss Marple's face remained composed, yet her hand rested briefly against the pew for balance. The pattern, she felt, had just widened, and within that widening lay the true shape of deceit. The path from the church to the rectory glistened with recent rain, each step reflecting the faint shimmer of lantern light. Miss Marple followed behind Inspector Hargrave and Constable Cray, her small figure moving swiftly despite the uneven ground. The vicarage windows were ablaze, figures moving behind the curtains with the anxious precision of those unprepared for catastrophe. Mrs. Lenton, the vicar's housekeeper, stood wringing her hands at the doorway. "They've carried her inside, Mrs. Leonard, I mean. It's dreadful, Miss Marple, dreadful." She was in the rose walk, lying beside the path as if she'd gone to gather petals. Inside the parlor, the scent of roses mingled with something acrid brandy, perhaps, or the faint residue of a tonic bottle hastily overturned. The vicar's wife lay upon the settee, pale but breathing, her lips faintly stained. The local doctor, a brisk man with sandy hair, was bending over her with professional detachment. "Poison, most likely," he said when Hargrave asked. "Not a lethal dose, not I think she'll recover, given rest. Whatever it was, she took it recently." "Deliberately?" the inspector pressed. "Too early to say. Could have been panic or remorse." Miss Marple, standing by the window, observed the untouched teacup on the side table. "Remorse," she repeated softly. "Yes, it does have a bitter taste when taken alone." The vicar entered then, his face ashen. "She's not." "Alive, Reverend," the doctor said, straightening. "You may sit with her once she wakes, but keep her calm." He departed soon after, leaving behind a silence that swelled with uneasy thoughts. The inspector examined the room with a measured glance, his gaze settling on a small tray where the teacup and sugar bowl rested. He lifted the spoon delicately. Residue here, crystalline, not granulated. "Sal volatile," Miss Marple murmured, crossing to the sideboard. "Quite harmless alone, but unpleasantly reactive if mixed with certain sleeping powders. A careless combination, or a calculated one." The vicar looked stricken. "Surely you don't imagine my wife. She's devoted to propriety." "She could never. Propriety, my dear Leonard," Miss Marple said kindly, "is a comfort to live with, but a terror to fail. Women who pride themselves on correctness are often least equipped for disgrace." He sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. "She's been so strange these last weeks. I thought it was the strain of all this gossip." She hardly spoke, save about Eleanor. Julian said she pitied her more than anyone knew. Hargrave's expression darkened. "Pity can be an alibi, Reverend, or a warning." Miss Marple turned toward the mantelpiece. A photograph stood there of the vicar and his wife beside Mrs. Julian at last year's harvest luncheon. The three smiling figures were so impeccably composed, it almost hurt to look at them. Yet behind that perfection, she felt the old tension of the village's unspoken hierarchies, appearances built like glass over fractures no one dared name. Hargrave broke the silence. "We'll search the study next." There may be correspondence linking her to Mrs. Julian's letters. As he moved toward the adjoining door, Miss Marple's gaze fell upon a small silver box near the lamp. It was finely engraved, a baptismal gift, she recalled vaguely, but what drew her attention was a faint powder smudge near the clasp, like the touch of a gloved finger. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I wouldn't open that without care. One shouldn't disturb symbols of innocence when they've been turned to instruments of guilt." He looked at her sharply. "You mean it's been used?" "I mean," she said gently, "that whoever handled it wished to appear unblemished." Cray re-entered then, his boots leaving damp prints on the carpet. "Sir, they've confirmed the organ loft door was unlocked from inside. No sign of force. So the person who left that note," Hargrave muttered, "was already here." Miss Marple's hand moved absently over the armrest, her eyes fixed upon the dim figure of the vicar's wife stirring faintly upon the couch. "Already here," she echoed, her voice no louder than breath. "And perhaps long accustomed to being so unremarked, unseen." The woman moaned softly, her eyes fluttering open. For a moment, confusion clouded them, then recognition and something like fear. Her gaze settled on her husband. "Leonard doesn't let them see the drawer," she whispered. The drawer. Hargrave stepped forward, but Miss Marple's light touch stopped him. "Not yet," she said softly. "Let her speak when her mind clears. Truth forced too soon only fractures further." The vicar clasped his wife's hand. "Hush, my dear. No one will harm you." Miss Marple turned toward the window, where the rain had begun again, gentle and persistent. Beneath that delicate sound, she could hear the faint hum of the village awakening to yet another scandal. Candles would be lit in parlors, voices hushed to moral tones. Everyone would ask the same question, yet mean something slightly different by it. What sort of woman does such a thing? Her eyes drifted to the photograph once more, to the frozen smiles of people who had believed goodness was a matter of composure. Perhaps that was the real poison, the belief that virtue could not err. Behind her, the vicar's wife stirred again, whispering something only her husband could hear. His face was drained of color. "What did she say?" Hargrave demanded. The vicar's lips trembled. "She said, 'The drawer under the hymn books, he'll know which one.'" Miss Marple's gaze lifted, her eyes quietly intent. The words had the unmistakable weight of both confession and invitation, and in that fragile balance, she sensed the story had only just turned its final corner. Inspector Hargrave's expression tightened as the words settled between them, heavy and uncertain. Miss Marple inclined her head toward the vicar, her voice calm and measured. "The drawer, Mr. Leonard. You know where she meant." He hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the adjoining study as though the room itself might reproach him. "The hymn book cabinet in the vestry," he said at last. "There's a false compartment beneath. It was meant for storing offertory envelopes." "Offertory or secrets," Miss Marple murmured. Both seemed to find the same sanctuary in St. Mary Mead. Hargrave gestured for Cray to accompany them. The vicar followed reluctantly, his hands clasped before him as if in silent prayer. Miss Marple brought up the rear, her small steps soundless against the corridor's worn carpet. The air grew colder as they neared the vestry, and the faint scent of extinguished candles lingered, the aroma of faith recently spent. The cabinet stood against the far wall, a tall oak structure polished to ecclesiastical perfection. Hargrave knelt and drew open the lower drawer, revealing a neat row of hymnals. For a moment, nothing seemed amiss. Then, guided by Miss Marple's quiet instruction, he lifted the bottom plank. Beneath it lay an envelope, the edges scorched as though rescued hastily from fire. Its seal bore the same faint impression as the fragment Miss Marple had found in the stove of the crest of Denholm and Pike solicitors. Hargrave slit it open with his penknife. Inside were several pages of thin stationery, the writing precise, deliberate Mrs. Julian's hand. He scanned the first line silently before exhaling through his teeth. It's her statement to the solicitor, dated last week. The vicar moved forward, eyes wide. May I? Better you don't, said Hargrave. It concerns your wife. Miss Marple stood motionless, her gaze resting not on the letter but on the light filtering through the stained glass window above. The soft colours fell across the inspector's face like the fragments of a moral parable. Hargrave read aloud, his voice steady. Should anything happen to me, I wish it known that the matter of the hymn fund is closed. I have forgiven Mrs. Leonard her trespass, though she fears exposure more than sin. If she will destroy the letter of confession I gave her, she may yet find peace. God help us both. The silence that followed seemed to erase every sound in the room. Even the air held its breath. The vicar's lips moved soundlessly before words emerged. A confession. My wife. Impossible. Not impossible, Miss Marple said gently, merely uncomfortable. Mrs. Leonard was treasurer of the fund, was she not? He nodded numbly. Eleanor found a discrepancy months ago. I thought it was an error in accounts. Ah, she said softly, and Mrs. Leonard thought otherwise. Respectability makes strange accountants of us all. Hargrave folded the letter carefully. So, the two women met in secret. Mrs. Julian offered silence, but she feared the promise might not be kept. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to the organ pipes, dull in the morning light. And promises, Inspector, are like hymns, they sound noble, until one forgets who wrote the words. Clara Denning entered then, pale and anxious. I was told you'd found something. Please, is it clear to my aunt? Hargrave turned toward her. It explains much, Miss Denning, though not everything. Your aunt tried to protect another's reputation. It may have cost her life. The girl's breath caught. Mrs. Leonard. Miss Marple moved closer, her voice low. Grief and fear can drive good women to desperate acts, but I suspect there was another hand, one that understood how to use a frightened conscience as a tool. Hargrave frowned. You think someone else exploited her guilt? Miss Marple nodded slightly. Someone who valued appearance above all, yet feared exposure more deeply still. The sort who would rather set fire to paper than risk a stain upon their name. The vicar sank into a chair, his face grey. Then my wife, she's innocent of murder? Innocence, said Miss Marple, is not always a matter of deed, but of design. We shall see which applies. Hargrave folded the letter, slipping it into his coat. This will suffice for now. I'll have the constable stand guard outside. Mrs. Leonard isn't to be questioned until the doctor clears her. As they left the vestry, Miss Marple lingered behind, her eyes tracing the edges of the hymn cabinet. The faint scorch marks along the drawer's rim told their own story, paper hastily hidden, perhaps even twice handled. She touched the polished wood lightly, feeling the warmth still trapped within it. Outside, the village bells began to toll again, this time for evening prayers. How strange, she thought, that even now the same voices would sing words of mercy without suspecting the true nature of the sins they atoned for. When she emerged into the fading daylight, a flock of starlings rose from the rectory roof, black against the pale sky. They wheeled together in perfect formation as if rehearsed, as if one single impulse guided them. Miss Marple watched them disappear over the churchyard and felt the shape of understanding begin to settle, quiet and certain in her mind. Something essential had aligned. Yet before she could test the thought, a new figure appeared at the gate, Mr. Badger, hat in hand, face drawn tight with apprehension. I've come to give myself up, he said hoarsely. Mr. Badger's declaration seemed to suspend the air itself, even though the damp wind at the gate ceased its rustling through the hedgerow. Miss Marple regarded him steadily, her expression not of shock but quiet curiosity, as one might show to a student who has finally spoken an expected answer in the wrong lesson. "Come inside, Mr. Badger," she said softly. "Confession is best heard under a roof." Inspector Hargrave, summoned by Cray's sharp whistle, arrived within moments. The organist stood rigid, water beading on his coat, the faint smell of pipe smoke clinging to him like guilt made visible. His hands shook slightly, not the tremor of terror, but of weary resolve. "I can't bear it any longer," he said. "The letters, the hymn, her face that morning, I can't keep them straight in my head. It was my fault she came back to the church." Hargrave motioned for him to sit. "Your fault in what sense, Mr. Badger?" The man swallowed hard. "I asked her to. She'd found out about the missing money. I told her Mrs. Leonard had only borrowed it, that no harm was done. I meant to repay it from the choir fund before anyone knew. She wouldn't listen. She said I'd made myself her accomplice by silence." "Go on," said Hargrave evenly. "She promised she'd go to the vicar after service, tell him everything. I begged her not to. I only wanted to delay her, just a day. I said I'd see her dead before she ruined 2 reputations. His voice cracked. "I didn't mean it. God help me, I didn't, but she looked so frightened. She ran out of the pew before the sermon ended. That was the last I saw of her." Hargrave's pencil moved briskly. "And you expect us to believe you didn't follow her?" Mr. Badger's shoulders slumped. "I went back later. Yes, after evening practice." The vestry door was ajar, and the well his breath hitched. She was there already. I thought she'd fallen. I touched her hand and it was cold." Miss Marple's gaze remained upon him, her tone almost kind. "And then you did something quite sensible, if not honest. You tidied." He looked up sharply. "How could you? You're a methodical man, Mr. Badger. You straightened the hymnals, locked the vestry, perhaps even wiped the rail where her hand had rested. But orderliness cannot always disguise disorder of conscience." Hargrave closed his notebook. "We'll verify your movements with your sister. For now, you'll come to the station." Mr. Badger nodded numbly and allowed Cray to lead him away. The lane swallowed their figures into mist, leaving Miss Marple and the inspector alone beneath the dripping yews. "You think he's lying?" Hargrave said at last. "I think," she replied, "that he's telling the truth he finds most bearable." "There's a difference." They walked back toward the vicarage. In the parlor, a lamp burned low, its light revealing the pale form of Mrs. Leonard asleep beneath a blanket. Her husband sat beside her, the letter Miss Marple had read now folded between his fingers like a prayer he could neither say nor destroy. She spoke again, he said quietly as they entered. "Just before you came," she said, "the hymn was meant for me." I don't know what she meant. Miss Marple drew a slow breath. Perhaps she finally heard its words. "Reverend Lead, kindly light. It was your wife's doing that it was chosen, wasn't it?" He nodded. She said it was her favorite. I thought it comforting. "Comfort," she said gently, "can be the most dangerous motive of all. It makes liars of good people." Hargrave turned to her. "Then you don't believe Badger killed Mrs. Julian?" Miss Marple's smile was faint, almost maternal. He loved his respectability too much for murder, but someone else loved it more. She moved toward the desk, glancing at the small silver box she had noticed before. With gloved fingers, she lifted the lid. Inside lay a fragment of paper folded into quarters, the last remnant of a burned letter. On it, a few words remained legible. "Will come before noon," Mrs. Julian's handwriting, Miss Marple murmured. So she arranged a meeting. The promise at morning service was literal after all. The vicar rose unsteadily. "You mean she came to?" "To return what she'd hidden," Miss Marple said softly. "The evidence of your wife's borrowing her confession, as she called it. But before she could, someone met her at the vestry. There was no struggle. only persuasion. Perhaps she stepped back to avoid a hand raised too hastily, or perhaps she simply lost her footing. Hargrave frowned. Accident, then? An accident shaped by fear, she said, and afterward, an elaborate effort to keep it respectable. Ashes, gloves, letters destroyed. In St. Mary Mead, respectability is often a matter of fireproofing. The inspector rubbed his brow. And who, in your view, lit that fire? Miss Marple looked toward the sleeping figure on the settee. Someone who already tried to burn her own guilt and nearly succeeded. The clock on the mantel chimed softly. In that measured rhythm, Miss Marple heard the pulse of the village settling again, preparing to carry on as though nothing had happened. Yet she knew that by tomorrow the choir would sing a little too sweetly, the parish ladies would speak a little too kindly, and everyone would think themselves better for the tragedy. She turned to Hargrave. Allow the doctor to rest her till morning. The truth will wake when she does. Outside, the rain had ceased, and the air smelled faintly of lavender and damp earth. Miss Marple stood at the gate, her face thoughtful in the dim light. The moral order of St. Mary Mead had been disturbed, yes, but not broken. Respectability, after all, could survive anything short of open confession. And somewhere beyond the hedge, a nightingale began to sing its pure note, trembling in the dark, like forgiveness that had not yet decided whether to be given. The song of the nightingale faded gradually into the soft grey hush of dawn. In the vicarage garden, dew clung to the hedges, and every petal seemed to hold its breath. The calm was deceptive, like the poised stillness before a congregation bows its head. Miss Marple, already awake, sat in the small sitting room where the events of the previous night still seemed to linger in the air. She had the look of someone quietly waiting for the final piece of a pattern to show itself. By 7 o'clock, Inspector Hargrave arrived, his overcoat damp with early mist and his face lined with sleeplessness. "You said the truth would wake when she did," he said, lowering his voice. "The doctor's given permission for a short interview, but I warn you, Miss Marple, she's not in a state for cross-examination." Miss Marple rose, smoothing her sleeve. "Dear me, Inspector, one never cross-examines a guilty conscience. One merely gives it the opportunity to speak politely." They entered the upstairs chamber together. Mrs. Leonard lay propped against the pillows, her complexion wan and her gaze unfocused. A half-drained cup of tea sat untouched by her side. The vicar hovered anxiously in the corner, torn between shame and relief at her survival. "Good morning, Mrs. Leonard," said Miss Marple kindly, moving closer. "You've had a dreadful shock, but you're among friends now. We only wish to understand what burden pressed so heavily upon you." For a long while, the woman said nothing. Then, in a voice brittle as frost, she murmured, "It wasn't meant to go so far." The vicar stirred. "My dear, if you're thinking of last Sunday—" She closed her eyes. "I only wished to protect you, Leonard. You and the church." Miss Marple's tone remained almost conversational. A noble wish, but such devotions often ask too high a price. "Tell us when Mrs. Julian came to you that morning. What did she intend?" Mrs. Leonard's eyes opened, filled with dread. "She had the letter I signed. She said she'd forgive everything, but she must restore it to the solicitor. I begged her not to. She said silence was a sin. She turned to leave, and I reached for her arm." The vicar's breath caught. "Dear God, it wasn't violent," she cried, trembling. She stepped back and slipped. I heard the sound, but when I looked down she wasn't moving. I wanted to call for help, but I saw the envelope. The seal was broken, the pages she'd written my name. Hargrave's pen scratched quietly on his notebook. "You burned them?" "I had to," she whispered. "For Leonard's sake. For the church. I thought if I hid the rest, if I made it seem like someone else," her voice failed. Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on the coverlet. "Appearances, my dear, can be dreadful masters. They make martyrs of the respectable and villains of the honest. The vicar turned away, covering his face. My wife, you should have told me. We could have borne disgrace together. Together, she repeated faintly. You would have despised me. Everyone would have. I wanted only to keep our place, our peace. Miss Marple regarded her quietly. Peace built upon silence rarely holds, Mrs. Leonard. It unravels the moment truth wishes to breathe. The inspector closed his notebook with a soft click. We'll take her statement formally once the doctor clears her, but I think we understand enough for now. As he left to make arrangements, Miss Marple lingered by the window, watching the village stir awake. A milk cart rattled down the lane, and somewhere a cockerel called that prosaic reminder that life continues even where tragedy has briefly paused it. The vicar's wife stirred again, her voice a thin thread. Do you believe God will forgive me, Miss Marple? That depends, my dear, on whether you can forgive yourself, she said gently. Divine mercy is often swifter than human honesty. Downstairs, Hargrave stood at the threshold, his face caught between frustration and relief. It's a strange case, he said. An accident tangled up with guilt, pride, and a great deal of foolish secrecy. I suppose we'll call it manslaughter by circumstance. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves with deliberate care. You might, but I prefer to call it an excess of virtue. He gave a rueful smile. You always find a moral when I'm still counting fingerprints. Fingerprints wash off, Inspector, she replied. But conscience leaves its mark in ink that never fades. They stepped outside together. Morning sunlight had begun to break through the mist, painting the church spire gold. For the first time in days, the bells remained silent, as though the parish itself required silence to absorb what had occurred. As they reached the gate, Clara Denning approached, her face pale but resolute. Is it true, she asked, that my aunt's death was not deliberate murder? Miss Marple took her hand. It was a tragedy born of fear and of love in its strangest disguise. Your aunt died trying to cleanse another's shame. It is the kind of sacrifice no one applauds because it looks too much like ordinary kindness. Clara's eyes filled. Will the village ever know the truth? They will know what suits them best, Miss Marple said softly. And they will discuss it with sympathy and relish over tea. But what truly matters will stay between a few souls who understand that decency can sometimes kill more gently than malice. As Clara walked away toward the churchyard, Miss Marple lingered by the gate a moment longer. The vicarage roses glistened in the new sun, their petals delicate as forgiveness offered too late. She touched one lightly, a simple gesture, almost maternal, and smiled, though it was not a cheerful smile. Back inside her cottage, she set the kettle to boil and laid her knitting upon the table. The morning paper had not yet arrived, but she could already imagine its headline, Tragic Death at St. Mary Mead Church Treasurer's Misstep. Such tidy words, she thought, for so untidy a truth. She poured her tea and looked toward the garden. The world, as ever, appeared serene, the robins busy in the hedge, the bees resuming their rounds. Yet in her mind she could still hear the echo of that morning's hymn, each line bearing its double meaning, one of faith, one of frailty. Her fingers moved automatically to her notebook, writing one last observation. Murder seldom begins in wickedness more often, in fear of losing respectability. She closed the book, folded her hands, and let the clock tick gently on, restoring the quiet rhythm of St. Mary Mead. Outside, the sun shone with determined innocence, and the village, decent, decorous, and incurably human, went on exactly as before. 2 days later, the village had resumed its measured breathing as if the shock of Mrs. Julian's death had been neatly folded into the parish register alongside births, banns, and flower rotas. The bells rang again for morning service, and St. Mary Mead, with the fine adaptability of English villages, contrived to appear unchanged. Miss Marple observed it all from her garden gate. Mrs. Price Ridley walked past in a new hat of suspicious brightness, nodding solemnly as though mourning were a civic duty performed with millinery. Colonel Melchett tipped his hat, murmuring something about the sad business before turning the conversation to the cricket scores. Appearances, Miss Marple thought, had been repaired with admirable speed. At the post office, conversation fluttered like lace in a breeze. Of course, Mrs. Clements confided in Mrs. Haydock, the papers are calling it an accident. A fall by the well, poor soul, but you know what that means, they've hushed it up. Mrs. Haydock sighed with relish. Quite right, too. Best not drag the vicarage through the mud. People forget that spiritual folk are still flesh and blood. Miss Marple, quietly buying her stamps, could not resist a mild comment. Indeed, Mrs. Haydock and flesh and blood are far less dangerous than pride and conscience. Those draw blood of a subtler kind. The women blinked, uncertain whether they had been agreed with or corrected, and Miss Marple went on her way, parcel in hand and a faint smile playing at her lips. At the vicarage, the curtains were half drawn. The Reverend Leonard had taken indefinite leave for the sake of rest, and his wife was recovering under the discreet care of a cousin in Bath. The choir practiced again under temporary direction, though even Mr. Badger's organ notes seemed quieter, now restrained, as though mourning not the dead, but the illusion of moral harmony that had gone with her. Inspector Hargrave visited one last time that afternoon. The formality of his presence was softened by his expression, a curious mixture of respect and bafflement. "You know," he said, sipping the tea she offered, "I can't help feeling that we've solved nothing at all." "Oh, I shouldn't say that," Miss Marple replied. "We've merely restored the balance in the only way small places ever permit. Truth here must wear its Sunday best, Inspector, otherwise no one would invite it to tea." He laughed quietly. "You have a very philosophical view of justice." "Justice," she said, folding her napkin neatly, "is rarely philosophical. It's human and therefore imperfect. Sometimes it means allowing people to go on, believing in their own goodness, even when it wobbles a little at the corners." He nodded, finishing his tea. "I'll file it as accidental death. But I'll know better, of course." "And yet," said Miss Marple gently, "you'll find yourself humming Lead Kindly Light one day and wondering whether the line, 'One step enough for me,' was written for us all. We seldom see more than the step we're taking, and perhaps it's as well." When he left, she walked with him to the gate. The evening sun was low, turning the church windows into pools of gold. For a long while she stood looking at them, those fragments of color through which light passed only after being broken. It seemed to her a fitting image of human goodness, beautiful, imperfect, dependent on cracks to let illumination through. A shadow moved beyond the hedge Clara Denning in her mourning coat, carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers. She stopped when she saw Miss Marple. "I've been to the churchyard," she said quietly. "It's strange I felt no bitterness, only peace." "That is a good sign," Miss Marple said. "Peace rarely visits those who demand it. It comes to those who accept what cannot be mended." Clara smiled faintly. "I wanted to thank you. You made them see Aunt Eleanor. She was not perfect, but kind. I'll stay in the cottage for a while if no one objects." "No one ever objects to goodness, my dear," said Miss Marple. "They only find it inconvenient now and then." When Clara had gone, Miss Marple returned to her parlour. The kettle whistled obligingly, and the day's newspaper lay folded beside her chair. It carried a modest headline: "Vicar's wife recovers after collapse parish tragedy declared misadventure." Below it, in smaller print, a brief note of gratitude from Reverend Leonard and his brave consort. She read it once, then set the paper aside. From the mantel clock came its familiar, faithful ticking, unhurried, unerring, indifferent to scandal or forgiveness. Miss Marple thought how peculiar time was capable of healing everything except the faint ache of understanding too much. Her knitting lay ready in its basket, the pattern a steady repetition of order and symmetry, and perhaps that, she reflected, was why she loved it. One could put the tangles right again with patience and gentle fingers, something human life seldom allowed. As she began a new row, the sound of the church bell drifted through the open window, not the solemn tolling of death now, but the bright, simple call to evening prayer. The same hymn echoed faintly on the breeze, the one that had begun it all. Led kindly light. Miss Marple smiled, her needles glinting in the late light. "Ah," she murmured softly. "The village is quite itself again, polished, pious, and perilously content." A moment later, she added the last note to her private ledger of reflection, a small scrap of truth kept only for herself. "It is never the wicked who trouble St. Mary Mead most, but the good who forget that goodness must bend a little to remain kind." The clock chimed once, as if in agreement.